The Soviet Union. Behind an iron curtain of secrecy, a brutally repressive society. On the world stage, a military powerhouse and sponsor of regional conflict. Once America's ally, but for the past 40 years, our bitter enemy in a superpower stalemate that has threatened to destroy the world. At the seat of Soviet power, the old inflexible men of the Politburo, their hawkish ideology forged in the angriest years of the Cold War. In 1985, ascending into this frigid and perilous climate came Mikhail Gorbachev, a youthful, vigorous leader determined to change his country's society, its economy, and its dangerous relationship with America. This is the story of the emergence of Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, of the most sweeping changes in the Soviet Union since the Russian Revolution, and of a series of unprecedented summits between the leaders of the world's greatest nations and their bold initiatives to pull their nations back from the brink of nuclear war. Through it all, ABC News was there. Watch now the original ABC News broadcasts of a great TV news story, Red Star Rising, the dawn of the Gorbachev era. From ABC News, great TV news stories with Peter Jennings, Sam Donaldson, Richard Threlkeld, and the worldwide resources of ABC News.
Once again, change in the Soviet Union. Konstantin Chernenko dies, Mikhail Gorbachev replaces him. The old guard out, the new guard in. Good evening. There have been some dramatic changes in the last 24 hours. First, the Soviet leader Konstantin Chernenko dies, and then within hours, record time, in fact, 54-year-old Mikhail Gorbachev is named to replace him. President Reagan entertains the idea of going to Chernenko's funeral and meeting the new leader, but finally decides he will not. Vice President Bush and Secretary of State Schultz will go instead.
The new Soviet leader led the mourners at the bier of Konstantin Chernenko this evening, the 54-year-old Mikhail Gorbachev quickly assuming the top leadership post 4 hours after the announcement Chernenko was dead. Foreign Minister Gromyko nominated Gorbachev for the General Secretary's job, and the Kremlin's old guard unanimously approved the Politburo's youngest and perhaps most dynamic member for that top leadership post. It was just 13 months ago in this very setting Chernenko had been leading the mourners for the late President Yuri Andropov, and now a new generation Soviet leader was consoling Chernenko's widow Anna. The announcement of the death of Chernenko came with tedious slowness, the Russian people learning of it well after most of the rest of the world already knew. And today's official medical bulletin confirmed what these last pictures of Chernenko alive clearly showed, that he was fast losing his battle for life. The bulletin saying Chernenko died of emphysema as well as deterioration of his heart and liver. But Moscow was full of crisis clues today before the official announcement. Limousines rushing toward the Kremlin, classical music replacing regular TV and radio programming. Flags with funereal bunting went up elsewhere in Moscow. There was neither shock nor surprise when the Soviet people learned of Chernenko's death. They knew he was gravely ill, and the swiftness with which a successor was named may have come as a relief, signaling that ailing and aging Soviet leaders may now be a thing of the past. Mikhail Gorbachev represents the post-war, post-Stalin era generation of Soviet leaders. And unlike other top figures here, he often appears in public with his attractive wife and family. Perhaps more importantly, Gorbachev is associated with economic reformers who would like to wring the stagnation out of the Soviet economy. And tonight, the new Soviet leader moved quickly to leave no doubts as to who's at the helm here. Gorbachev signaling the United States there can be no hope of stopping the nuclear arms race unless the Reagan administration pledges itself to preventing an arms race in space. Walter Rogers, ABC News, Moscow.
The British government got a good look at the new Soviet leader late last year when he and his wife made a trip to London. Now, as we have learned in the past, the first impressions of a new Soviet leader are not always the right ones. But as ABC's Mike Lee reports, the British were impressed.
To the Western world, Mikhail Gorbachev had his coming out when he came to London last December for trade and cultural talks with Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher.
I like Mr. Gorbachev. We can do business together. We both believe in our own political systems.
But he has changed Western perceptions of Soviet politicians.
Mr. Gorbachev is extremely alert, highly intelligent, very well educated. He's got a degree in law.
John Brown, a conservative member of Parliament who acted as a part-time guide for Gorbachev in London, believes that a star was born.
Very good speaker, very good at answering questions off the cuff, which is rare. But above all, he's got charisma. I mean, he's got charisma Western style.
That polish is hard-earned. The son of a Russian peasant, Gorbachev studied law and politics and earned his political fame for efforts to reform Soviet agriculture. He doesn't conduct business in English, but shows signs of understanding our language, our culture, and our fashion. Mrs. Gorbachev has a flair for clothes, as well as a doctorate in philosophy.
Together, I would see them having the potential of forming the Russian equivalent of President Jack and Jacqueline Kennedy team.
Thank you very much.
Russians are sensitive to the image that their country presents to the world, and to see Gorbachev, who was clearly a success in London, then to that extent they must be welcoming his appearance, if only on the grounds of his vigor.
In Soviet terms, he has star quality. Therefore, in political terms, Mikhail Gorbachev is a force for the West to reckon with. Mike Lee, ABC News, London.
Soon after Mikhail Gorbachev takes office, President Ronald Reagan and the Soviet premier agree to meet for summit talks in Geneva, Switzerland, the first between the superpowers in 6 years. Among the topics to be discussed are nuclear arms reduction, human rights, and the Strategic Defense Initiative, President Reagan's controversial space-based defense program. The day is November 18th, 1985.
Good evening. It is already Tuesday morning here in this Swiss city, and there is a mood of expectation. It is a long time since an American president has met with a Soviet leader. The Soviet and the American delegations have spent the day before the summit telling anyone who will listen that they are here in good faith. Mikhail Gorbachev arrived today, and we begin with our Moscow bureau chief, Walter Rogers.
Mikhail Gorbachev arrived with his wife on his arm and a promise to halt the nuclear arms race, preventing what he called its spread into other spheres. In frigid weather, the Swiss welcome was warm, although the Soviet leader appeared bothered by the cold. Still, when the Swiss president reminded Gorbachev and President Reagan this summit could decide the fate of mankind, Gorbachev picked up on it quickly.
The peoples of the Soviet Union and the Americans and others expect positive results. May I assure them we will try to bring about that outcome.
Then the Gorbachevs were off on a busy pre-summit schedule. First came a pep talk to Soviet diplomats and their families here. Gorbachev joked about the weather, reminding everyone it's colder in Moscow. One woman asked what he would do in his meeting with President Reagan.
I'm afraid you will have to wait till later to hear the answer to that.
Gorbachev has given no hint of new flexibility, nor whether he'll offer any additional proposals for cutting strategic arms. Instead, he's playing the perfect guest, sharing the summit spotlight with his stylish wife, Raisa, letting others talk about the issues. Soviet Foreign Ministry spokesman Vladimir Lemeyko tried talking arms control today, but he had to face the challenge of a human rights activist. Irina Grivnina had been jailed in a Soviet labor camp, and she wanted to share the floor with Soviet officials who would have none of it.
Help us against the KGB, please.
The Soviets walked out, holding their news conference elsewhere. Human rights simply isn't high on the Soviet summit agenda. They're here to talk about cosmic issues, war and peace and arms control. To the Soviets, everything else is secondary. Walter Rogers, ABC News, Geneva.
Well, there was certainly more decorum today on the American side of the aisle. As our White House correspondent Sam Donaldson reports, it was a day to emphasize realism.
President Reagan received his own official welcoming ceremony from the Swiss today. Same spot, same drill as Gorbachev. But all the interest was on tomorrow and the two leaders' first fateful meeting. Gorbachev, the president was told, said he had come to end the arms race.
We both must have the same intention. Yes, sir. If he feels as strongly that way as I do, then we'll end the arms race.
But he says he also wants to stop Star Wars.
I think when it's explained to him, you'll find that that can help us end the arms race.
And on Star Wars, the strategic defense shield, U.S. officials continued to insist there would be no giving in to the Soviet demands that it be scrapped.
We have a disagreement. We're going to have to talk it out.
So far, of course, much of the talk from the Soviet side here has been negative. even personal when it comes to Ronald Reagan, even old Ronald Reagan movies.
They are berated anyway.
And why get so personal?
What are they trying to do in knocking President Reagan? Are they afraid of him? Are they trying to knock him down? I think that's probably what's behind their propaganda.
All this verbal jousting by the spear carriers ends tomorrow, when inside this villa on the outskirts of Geneva, the Villa Fleur d'Eau, Mr. Reagan and Mr. Gorbachev sit down to talk. First in the library, just one-on-one with only the translators present. Then in the living room at the morning plenary session with their aides. A general gripe session, if you will, aimed at clearing the air. The double translation will be simultaneous.
The two guys that sit over by the door, one Soviet, one U.S., they talk into a little doodad. And it goes into the earphone.
And what will come through those earphones? Not even his top aides are sure precisely what the president will say.
The president has prepared his own presentation for tomorrow, and so it will be vintage President Reagan.
Vintage Ronald Reagan has gotten the job done for 50 years. But the question is tomorrow, will it work on Gorbachev? Sam Donaldson, ABC News, Geneva.
When the President and Mr. Gorbachev sit down tomorrow, the principal focus for most of us will be what progress, if any, they make on controlling the nuclear arms race. But the competition in nuclear weapons does not exist in a vacuum. In the developing world, the United States and the Soviet Union are already at war, as our surrogates were in Vietnam.
The Soviet-American competition is played out on the regional battlefields of the Third World. In Afghanistan, Soviet troops are fighting the American-supported Afghan guerrilla movement. In Southeast Asia, the Soviet-supported Vietnamese are occupying Kampuchea. The United States is supporting insurgent anti-government factions. In southern Africa, the pro-Soviet government of Angola is fighting a guerrilla organization which has received U.S. aid in the past and may soon get it again. And in Central America, the pro-Soviet Sandinista government in Nicaragua is confronting the Contras, supported and funded by the United States. These are the conflicts Mr. Reagan wants to talk to Mr. Gorbachev about.
Good evening. President Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev have met for the first time, and it has been a pretty long day of private dialogue. Both sides have agreed they will say nothing in public about substance now, but the spokesman for both men say the mood and the atmosphere are good. ABC's Sam Donaldson was there for that first hello.
Ready to go was the signal from President Reagan as he waited in the Fleur d'Eau mansion on the outskirts of Geneva, site of this first day's talks. At precisely 10 a.m., the Russian-built Black Sill limousine drove up, and out stepped the General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, Mikhail Gorbachev. They shook hands on the driveway, the first moment of meeting for the 74-year-old American president and the 54-year-old Russian leader. Then they posed for pictures on the back terrace. "Where's your overcoat?" Gorbachev must have said in Russian. "I left it inside," the president seemed to say in English. But no matter the language barrier, inside as they posed for the press, the interpreters were present.
Mr. President, what are you going to say to Mr. Gorbachev, sir, to try to convince him that you want peace?
Sam, that will be the subject of the meetings, I think, for both of us. I believe we both do share the same ideas.
Mr. General Secretary, Mr. Gromyko once said of you, "You have a nice smile, but iron teeth." I guess meaning you're tough.
It hasn't yet been confirmed. As of now, I'm still using my own teeth. I think that both the President and myself have good grounds to believe that we can have a good talk.
With the press gone and top aides left to wait, the two met alone with their interpreters, not for the 15 minutes scheduled, but for a full hour. When they finally joined their aides for the first plenary session, the president said they talked about lots of general topics. And Gorbachev was asked whether the length of the private meeting was a good sign.
I would think so.
It had worked so well, perhaps, that after cutting short the second plenary session of the day, one similar to this one held in the afternoon, President Reagan led his guest on a walk down to a bathhouse by the side of a small swimming pool, where by a roaring fire, again, just the two of them, plus interpreters, talked for almost 50 minutes. And what had the day's talk produced? When the word came, it turned out to be that both sides had agreed there would be no word. Instead, there would be a news blackout until the summit is over.
Those who talk don't know what's going on, and those who know what's going on won't talk.
The U.S. side did say the atmosphere today was good, businesslike, not like the combative meeting between Gorbachev and Secretary of State Schultz in Moscow 2 weeks ago.
Not the same atmosphere as the Moscow talks.
Tonight, the Gorbachevs hosted a dinner at the Villa Rosa, where they are staying for the Reagans. Nancy Reagan and Raisa Gorbachev met each other's husband for the first time. They posed for pictures and again, lots of smiles. But if there is more here at this summit than smiles, no one will say. Sam Donaldson, ABC News, Geneva.
With a smile and a handshake and some modest agreement, the Geneva summit is over. This day began when Mr. Reagan and Mr. Gorbachev made one final formal appearance together in Geneva. And that's where we begin. Here's our White House correspondent, Sam Donaldson.
They met for the last time in this summit at the International Press Center beneath their respective flags to report on what they had and had not accomplished. To the audience of officials and reporters, each delivered short remarks. Gorbachev went first.
Мы с президентом проделали большую работу.
The President and I have done a huge amount of work.
Углубленно.
We've decided that we must help to decrease the threat of nuclear war. We must not allow the arms race to move off on into space, and we must cut it down on Earth. The solving of the most important problems concerning the arms race and increasing hopes of peace. We didn't succeed in reaching at this meeting.
Then it was the President's turn.
I came to Geneva to seek a fresh start in relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, and we have done this.
When the two leaders had finished, Foreign Minister Shevardnadze and Secretary of State Schultz signed a new cultural exchange agreement. Consulates in New York and Kiev will also be opened. Mr. Gorbachev and Mr. Reagan looked on in clear delight. But the big news about people-to-people exchanges was not in the fact that artists and scholars and the like will visit, but that the two leaders have agreed to meet again in two future summits. Next year in Washington, the year after in Moscow.
Less than a year after the summit, Mikhail Gorbachev initiates sweeping changes inside the Soviet Union. The world learns two Russian words that form the cornerstone of the new Gorbachev program. Glasnost, meaning openness, and Perestroika, meaning restructuring. On the occasion of the 27th Communist Party Congress, ABC News focuses on Russia at the dawn of the Gorbachev era. The day is February 23, 1986.
5,000 members of the Soviet Communist Party have gathered in Moscow this weekend. They are there to attend what may be the most important Soviet Party Congress in 25 years. And they are there to set policy for the Soviet Union through the end of this century. This is the first party Congress for the new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. And as Walter Rogers reports, it is a critical test for him.
A disabled Russian truck. The Soviet driver struggling to repair it, even setting the frozen engine on fire to get it to start. As the 27th Soviet Party Congress meets this week, that symbolizes the task before the Soviet leadership, trying to ignite a stalled economy and light a fire underneath a people unaccustomed to hard work. A new 5-year plan will be unveiled as Mr. Gorbachev charts a course which he hopes will make the Soviet Union the technological equal of the United States and Japan by the year 2000. And young Soviets especially realize their country is at a crucial turning point.
We haven't used all the resources which we have, and now we are going to use everything.
Mr. Gorbachev is also expected to use this party Congress to break with the past, denouncing the corruption and stagnation of the Brezhnev era. The thousands and thousands of delegates now in Moscow for the party Congress have not lost faith. They believe their Leninist socialist system can be salvaged, that it just needs fixing. The problem for Mr. Gorbachev is that he's trying to make an economic and political system designed in the 1930s run smoothly today. He thinks he can do it by whip-cracking and jaw-boning. And what's at stake is the Soviet Union's status as a superpower. Walter Rogers, ABC News, Moscow.
Soviet leader Gorbachev says the health of his country's economy is in the hands of the worker. But increasingly, it is hands like these that both the worker and Gorbachev are depending on for the future. Advanced automation, desperately needed to ease a continuing labor shortage, is part of a wave of reforms that Gorbachev is initiating to kickstart the Soviet Union's dragging economy. No aspect of this push is more critical than the belated plunge into computers. The Soviets are launching a countrywide campaign to put at least some kind of computer into every school. In the city of Minsk, for example, one school had a dozen terminals wired to a central computer. The memory and calculating potential of this machine that filled half a room is comparable to a single top-of-the-line home computer built in the West that could fit into a briefcase. And the Soviet computer cost 100 times more. One place in the civilian sector we did find sophisticated computers was at this high-energy physics laboratory in central Siberia. Here, scientists had to build their own one-of-a-kind system because big, high-speed computers for their specialized calculations are simply not available in the Soviet Union. The Soviets do world-class research here, pulling apart atoms and nuclear accelerators. Their custom-made computers are powerful, the quality of their research excellent. Where the Soviets traditionally have problems, however, is converting their outstanding research into the more mundane technologies that can help in manufacturing, help to raise the quality of shoddy Soviet-made goods, and to boost output. Gorbachev and the political leadership in Moscow recognize the problem and are beginning to attack it. Some of Gorbachev's economic reforms can be seen most vividly far away from Moscow. ABC News was shown one example here in the city of Novosibirsk, a sprawling industrial center of 1.5 million people in the heart of Siberia. This plant, with its precision tools, makes giant furnaces for the steel industry. As part of the campaign to modernize, the plant manager has just gotten his own computer terminal to monitor output. In the factory, a task like this, done by 4 workers, we are told, will soon be accomplished by just 1, with new computer-driven robots not yet installed. So computers, crude as they may be, are slowly coming to the factories, to the schools, but will they ever be put into the hands of individuals? In a country where it is against the law for an individual to own a printing press or Xerox machine, and where all information is strictly controlled, the notion of giving millions of people knowledge of and access to their own computers poses a real dilemma. But without widespread use of computers, modernization will stagnate. With computers, there will be an explosion of information that in the years ahead could have a profound impact on how this country is governed. John McWethy, ABC News, Moscow.
Gorbachev's challenges extend throughout Soviet society, from technology and industry to agriculture and healthcare.
A Soviet ambulance on the way to an emergency speeds through the streets of Tallinn, capital of the Soviet Republic, Estonia. Moments before, a call came to this central control over a special telephone line like our 911. It's a woman in labor. Doctors hurry, and an ambulance is dispatched to pick up 20-year-old Eva Molros. A doctor rides in each Soviet ambulance. Most are women because 65% of the doctors in the Soviet Union are women. This emergency service is touted as one of the most effective parts of the Soviet healthcare system, which also boasts twice as many hospital beds as the U.S. and twice as many doctors. But experts in Soviet medicine like Georgetown's Murray Fishback say don't confuse quantity with quality.
And when one looks below the tip of the iceberg, then you find that, in fact, they're having a great deal of difficulty. Beginning both in 1964, when we see an upward movement in the crew death rate, but especially in the last 6-7 years.
Today, life expectancy for Soviet men is 63, down from 65 just 10 years ago when the government started to spend less on health care. Smoking, a high-fat diet, and alcoholism have led to a dramatic rise in cancer and heart disease. But infectious diseases are the Soviets' most immediate problem. Hepatitis is rampant. 1.4 million cases last year, 20 times the number in the U.S. Measles, 400,000 cases in the Soviet Union, 200 times the number in America. Encephalitis and meningitis are also on the rise. This situation is of special concern to someone like Eva Molros, who's having her first baby. These diseases and a lack of a coordinated childhood vaccination program are the primary cause for increases in the infant mortality rate, which is now 3 times higher than the U.S. 30 Soviet babies out of every 1,000 die before their first birthday. Despite their problems, the Soviets are proud that all health care is free.
It's free of charge, because in your country, patients calculated each day, because he has to pay for each day, And we don't insist, and push patients out from the hospital,
Eva Morosa's hospital stay, even this ride in the city's only modern ambulance, all free. For non-emergencies and routine care, the average Soviet citizen is assigned one of the country's 60,000 polyclinics. The Soviets showed us this clinic in Tallinn. They say it's one of the country's best equipped, but many of the instruments are old-fashioned and procedures outmoded. Doctors only have a small light and a metal probe to examine this 4-year-old boy's infected ear. This woman's tonsillitis is being treated with hydrogen peroxide and a local antiseptic. She'll receive no antibiotics. This man's cavity will be fixed with a 20-year-old drill and no Novocaine. In fact, the Soviets use anesthetics rarely, if at all. Ludmila Kuznetsova, who now lives in the United States, once was refused anesthesia for an operation on her uterus because she complained of pain.
Doctor said me that they will do it without any anesthesia because I behaved not well.
You had a DNC without any anesthesia?
Without any anesthesia.
Why?
It was for 40 minutes. He claimed it was a punishment for screaming while in labor.
Anesthetics, antibiotics, some vaccines, and other medicines are not routinely given. The Soviets don't produce enough to meet their needs and won't spend enough to import medicines from the West. Last year, the Soviets spent $250 billion on health care. 3 priorities. Olga Irovna, a dentist, only earns about $225 a month. She's paid less, so others can be paid more.
My salary is less than a bus driver's. My working conditions are easier. In my country, laborers get paid more. It's an incentive to get people to do the physical jobs.
Besides doctors' salaries, the government determines working hours and sets quotas and limits on everything from the number of bandages to be used in a hospital to the number of appendectomies that can be performed. There's even a limit on the number of deaths that can occur at a hospital. Because exceeding that limit could prompt an official investigation, it's common for hospitals to turn away terminally ill patients and emergency patients who are dead on arrival.
Soviet domestic problems spur Gorbachev to continue his pursuit of arms control abroad, hoping to trim Russia's huge military budget and recast the relationship between the superpowers. Less than a year after the Geneva summit, a second Reagan-Gorbachev summit is scheduled to be held at Reykjavik, Iceland. The day is October 9th, 1986.
We have serious problems with the Soviet positions on a great many issues, and success is not guaranteed. But if Mr. Gorbachev comes to Iceland in a truly cooperative spirit, I think we can make some progress.
Mrs. Reagan stayed home, despite the surprise announcement Sunday that Mrs. Gorbachev would be in Iceland. The First Lady, it is said, was determined not to be manipulated like that. At Andrews Air Force Base, Soviet Ambassador Yuri Dobinin saw the president off. The 2 men were smiling, and during the flight over, aides said Mr. Reagan was well prepared and confident he's taking the right approach to resolve major problems. The problems will be discussed by the 2 leaders in 3 sessions held at Hovde House, overlooking the Reykjavik harbor. Most of the time will be spent one-on-one between Mr. Reagan and Mr. Gorbachev in a small northeast corner room. There is a room prepared for expanded sessions with senior aides, but it may not get much use.
The president says he wants to talk about many things here, but the guts of this meeting is arms control. That's why it was proposed, that's why it was agreed to, that's the issue on which it will be judged. U.S. officials seem to be optimistic. Sam Donaldson, ABC News, Reykjavik.
This evening, U.S. and Soviet arms control experts sat down together at Hovde House to work out what appears to be shaping up as the framework of the first superpower arms control deal in 7 years. Since the moment President Reagan and General Secretary Gorbachev met this morning, the signs of progress have been there, the mood upbeat. At the beginning of their meeting, Mr. Reagan was asked if he expected progress.
I'm always optimistic.
Good evening. President Reagan returned to Washington tonight smiling, but clearly a disappointed man following the failure of the Iceland summit.
President Reagan left the Iceland summit with none of the gains he had hoped to make. He explained it all hinged on his strategic defense initiative.
the Soviet Union insisted that we sign an agreement that would deny to me and to future presidents for 10 years the right to develop, test, and deploy a defense against nuclear missiles for the people of the free world. This we could not and will not do.
It was Gorbachev who took the early initiative, pulling from his briefcase a detailed set of proposals to cut both sides' strategic arsenals by roughly 50% in 5 years and to reduce intermediate-range missiles in Europe to zero. Though the president had not come to Iceland prepared for such sweeping negotiations, he thought the discussions would be more general. He and his team plunged in. By early evening, the two leaders turned over their notes to working groups and detailed negotiations began. The Soviets, who have more strategic weapons than the U.S., wanted to simply cut each side's arsenal in half, leaving themselves with a numerical advantage. The U.S. said no, the end result had to leave equal numbers for each side.
At 3 a.m., the Soviets said they were prepared to agree to 50% reductions, resulting in equal ceilings for both sides.
In the late-night sessions at Hofty House, the U.S. side had made no provisions for duplicating its draft proposals other than typing many copies. The Soviets were doing it the old-fashioned way with carbon paper.
So they depended on low technology, and they had what they needed, and we depended on high technology, and we didn't. There may be a lesson in that. We ended up using their carbon paper.
It was Sunday when Gorbachev was pressing for more limitations on the Star Wars Strategic Defense Initiative that the president surprised not only the Soviets but his own advisors. He offered to extend the limitations contained in the ABM Treaty for 10 years on the condition that both sides eliminate all their strategic nuclear weapons at the end of that time.
I think they were taken aback by the proposal. They didn't reject it on the spot.
Gorbachev eventually demanded that the U.S. limit all Star Wars research to just the laboratory. That's when negotiations broke down. So the Iceland summit was a weekend of surprises and high-risk bargaining. Though both Washington and Moscow are now claiming it was a success, it's doubtful either side will risk trying something like it again anytime soon. John McWethy, ABC News, the State Department.
This is an ABC News special report. Now, from New York, here's Peter Jennings.
Good afternoon. In just about 30 seconds from now, President Reagan is going to come to the press room of the White House to make what is surely, I emphasize surely, the announcement that there's going to be a summit meeting this year between himself and the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. Having said surely, if he doesn't say that, it will be even more extraordinary news because he's going to be accompanied by the Secretary of State George Shultz and the Soviet Foreign Minister Edvard Shevardnadze, who arrived back in Washington from Moscow and Czechoslovakia this morning. You will probably have noticed in the news over the last few days that the Soviet Union and the Soviet leader particularly has taken an on-again, off-again attitude about having a summit meeting, but then asked that his Soviet foreign minister come back to Washington. We are almost certain that is what the president is going to talk about this afternoon. That's Mr. Shevardnadze, who will stand to the right as you look at it. Mr. Schultz,
I
well
have
known
just
to all of us.
finished meeting with Soviet Foreign Minister Shevardnadze, and Mr. Shevardnadze presented a letter to me from General Secretary Gorbachev, who has accepted my invitation to come to Washington for a summit beginning on December 7th.
Good evening. The Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev has arrived here in Washington. In fact, he's already well ensconced at the Soviet embassy, a 5-minute walk from the White House down there. His arrival here today makes many points, including the one that this normally cynical city can get fairly excited when you can smell history in the cold evening air. Mr. Gorbachev is the first Soviet leader to visit here in 14 years. And no sooner had he arrived than he was hinting he had something of substance to say about reducing international tension.
When Mr. Gorbachev's Ilyushin 62 landed at Andrews Air Force Base, he became the first Soviet leader to visit the United States since Leonid Brezhnev 14 years ago. In a brief arrival statement, the Soviet leader said that besides signing a treaty eliminating intermediate and shorter-range nuclear missiles, he will push President Reagan to make deep cuts in both countries' longer-range nuclear arsenals.
We have what to say to the American leaders, to the President of the United States, and we are hoping that we will hear some new words on their side. I would like to wish peace and well-being to all Americans.
And in a brief aside to Secretary of State Shultz, Mr. Gorbachev was overheard to invoke the help of Providence in the summit.
There was a sense of power and history at the White House this morning, unmatched in recent times, as the old anti-communist warrior Ronald Reagan welcomed the younger, aggressive leader of the Soviet Union. General Secretary Gorbachev may not technically rate the 21-gun salute given a head of state, but he got one nonetheless. A recognition of the power that he and the president share in the nuclear age, and of the history of a tense superpower relationship which this visit could help make easier.
Today marks a visit that is perhaps more momentous than many which have preceded it, because it represents a coming together not of allies, but of adversaries. And yet I think you'll find during your stay that the American people believe that a stranger is a friend they have yet to meet, and that there's still a wellspring of goodwill here.
Нас разделяет не только океаны.
We realize that we are divided not only by the oceans, but also by profound historical, ideological, socio-economic, and cultural differences. But the wisdom of politics today lies in not using those differences as a pretext for confrontation, enmity, and the arms race.
The South Lawn welcoming ceremony was impressive, but the centerpiece of the day, indeed the event that made this summit possible, was the signing of the new Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in the White House East Room. Before an audience of each country's top officials, including a delegation from Capitol Hill, the two leaders signed 2 copies of the treaty. And with a stroke of their pens, set in motion over the next 3 years, the complete elimination of medium-range and shorter-range missiles worldwide. About 850 for the United States, about 1,900 for the Soviets. The two men exchanged pens at the signing and exchanged messages in a mood that was both formal to match the deed and informal to match the new spirit of harmony the deed represents.
Для всех, но прежде всего для наших двух великих.
The treaty, whose text is on this table, offers a big chance at last to get onto the road leading away from the threat of catastrophe. It is our duty to take full advantage of that chance and move together toward a nuclear-free world.
We can only hope that this history-making agreement will not be an end in itself, but the beginning of a working relationship that will enable us to tackle the other issues, urgent issues before us. We have listened to the wisdom in an old Russian maxim, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. Mr. General Secretary, though my pronunciation may give you difficulty, the maxim is doverjai no proverjai, trust but verify.
На каждой встрече вы это повторяете.
You repeat that at every meeting.
A 4th Reagan-Gorbachev summit is planned for Moscow in May 1988 to ratify agreements on nuclear arms. The day is May 25th, 1988.
A Moscow summit is just the sort of pick-me-up that Mikhail Gorbachev could use just now. After 3 years of his perestroika, the Soviet system is still under the weather and his policies are under siege.
Is Gorbachev in trouble? I think he has been in trouble from the start, really, and is possibly in deeper trouble now than he has been at any point.
It's ironic because at the same time he's managed to breathe a little spring into Soviet society, people have more freedom now than ever. They're forced to make do with less of everything else.
That average Soviet citizen has seen a change, but for the worse. There are fewer items in the stores. The quality of food, even something as fundamental as food, is worse than in the past.
Worse because the government has decided to reform the rest of the Soviet economy, construction and heavy industry, at the expense of the consumer sector. So only 1 in 6 families has a telephone. Only 1 in 24 owns a car. The quality of most things people can buy here is third-rate. People spend up to 3 hours a day waiting in line. The longest lines are at the vodka shops. It costs the average Russian a full day's pay for 1 bottle, or for a pound of meat at the private markets.
As a consequence, there is a kind of growing nervousness on the part of workers and consumers within the Soviet Union that, in fact, so-called restructuring and economic reform is going to be taken out of their hide, and they're not going to get very much for it.
And it's the fear of what next. Unemployment, for example, in a society where a job has always been officially guaranteed. The Maxim Gorky Tool Works in Kiev is, like two-thirds of Soviet industry, officially self-financing now, meaning it has to make a profit or else. For the first time, they've got to start laying off people this year. By the year 2000, 16 million people will lose their jobs in the name of efficiency. Mr. Gorbachev has his defenders here, intellectuals, technocrats, the young people, the next generation, who are remarkably candid about what's wrong and how to fix it.
Everything is worse than it could be.
I'm very sad because people are so passive, too passive now.
Perestroika is the only way out of this situation of economic stagnation.
But Gorbachev has powerful critics, too, in the bureaucracy. Perestroika is designed to take authority away from the bureaucrats and give it to the local managers. A lot of the bureaucrats will lose their jobs if Gorbachev carries out his promise to cut the bureaucracy by half. The secret police are worried they're going to lose political control of the people. The military is worried about losing its political clout and suspects that Gorbachev's planning some big cuts in military spending. Can Gorbachev survive his critics?
It's very uncertain, and the forces ranged against him are numerous and strong and could become stronger.
Mikhail Gorbachev knows that the last man who tried to make fundamental changes here, Nikita Khrushchev, was summarily sacked and remains only an asterisk in Soviet history. But Gorbachev also knows the Soviet Union cannot stand still and survive. In the words of another of his predecessors 70 years ago, it is either full steam ahead or perish. Richard Threlkeld, ABC News, Kiev.
Former White House scene stager Michael Deaver couldn't have imagined it in his wildest dreams. Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev strolling around Red Square in Moscow, taking in the sights and talking to the tourists.
Господин президент Reagan.
Well, how do you do?
So friendly was it all that at one point, President Reagan threw his arm around Gorbachev, just a little short of a Jimmy Carter Brezhnev bear hug. And at another point, completely took back his evil empire pronouncement.
You still think you're in an evil empire, Mr. President?
No.
Why not?
I was talking about another time and another era.
But if Gorbachev was charming the president was reaching out to the Soviet people today with his own patented brand of charm. Lunching at the Writers' Union with such artists as historian Roy Medvedev and poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko. Although during the speeches, Mr. Reagan, who hadn't slept well overnight, nodded occasionally. But the centerpiece of the president's day, indeed of his effort to reach the Soviet public, came at Moscow University, when, in an address to the student body, Mr. Reagan made the case for democracy and freedom.
Freedom is the recognition that no single person, no single authority or government has a monopoly on the truth. Today, the world looks expectantly to signs of change.
For the first time in 16 years, the U.S. and the Soviet Union have ratified an arms control treaty and made more progress on another one. We begin tonight with our White House correspondent, Sam Donaldson.
The ceremony to cap the Moscow summit that President Reagan had so much wanted took place this morning in the Kremlin's Vladimir Hall. With Senators Byrd and Dole among the guests, the superpower leaders signed the Senate-approved ratification documents for the INF Treaty, eliminating all medium-range missiles. And as the old saying goes, history was made.
The era of nuclear disarmament has begun. I believe that no one can now close that book and put it aside.
We must not stop here, Mr. General Secretary. There is much more to be done.
Descending on America today, Mikhail Gorbachev, here to speak at the United Nations, to meet with President Reagan, and soon to be President Bush. Mr. Gorbachev apparently comes with two main objectives: to impress on the United Nations his view of where the world should be going, and to find out as best he can what George Bush thinks on the very same subject. Will there be continuity in Soviet-American relations? We begin with our Moscow correspondent, Walter Rogers.
10 hours after taking off from Moscow, Mr. Gorbachev's plane touched down in New York, marking his second visit to the United States in a year. But Gorbachev quickly signaled he has come to speak to the world when he addresses the United Nations tomorrow.
We are living in a world which is going through some very crucial changes, and all nations have their own concerns, their own interests.
The Soviet leader's tone was moderate, and although he appeared to recognize that when he meets with Mr. Reagan and Mr. Bush, he will be dealing with a government in transition, he was nonetheless eager to get on with the business begun with the Reagan administration.
The meeting itself will doubtless promote greater dynamism in the dialogue and an expansion of cooperation between our two countries.
For the first time in almost 30 years, a Soviet leader has spoken to the United Nations, and no Soviet leader has ever been as outspoken or forthcoming as Mikhail Gorbachev was, volunteering, among other things, to cut back on Soviet military strength in Europe and in Asia. Never before have the current and future presidents of the United States sat down with the president of the Soviet Union to maintain a stable relationship. We're going to begin at the United Nations, where Mr. Gorbachev had a golden opportunity to impress the 159 members of the General Assembly, and he didn't waste it. Here's ABC's Walter Rogers.
The Soviets had been promising a pre-Christmas surprise, and it was a blockbuster. Mr. Gorbachev announcing that on its own, the Soviet Union will voluntarily cut its armed forces to make them less threatening.
Within the next 2 years, their numerical strength will be reduced by 500,000 men. This will be done unilaterally.
The Gorbachev cuts will mean removing 50,000 Soviet troops and 5,000 tanks from East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Combined with additional force reductions in the western part of the Soviet Union, Mr. Gorbachev says he's eliminating a total of 10,000 tanks, 8,500 artillery pieces, and 800 combat aircraft. Along the Soviet border with China, Mr. Gorbachev also announced further unspecified force reductions. He then made it clear he's eager to do business with the new American administration.
The next U.S. administration, headed by President-elect George Bush, will find in us a partner who is ready, without long pauses or backtracking, to continue the dialogue in a spirit of realism, openness, and goodwill.
For a Soviet leader, it was a most uncharacteristic speech, Mr. Gorbachev promoting human rights and declaring a new political manifesto.
It is obvious, for example, that the use or threat of force can no longer and must no longer be an instrument of foreign policy.
This speech was clearly Mr. Gorbachev's assertion of his vision and philosophy of a new world. The Soviet leader was also asserting his own control over his defense establishment today with those one-sided military cuts. His chief of staff, Marshal Sergei Akrameyev, has now resigned, the Soviets citing reasons of health. But on balance, the Soviet military has not been overly enthusiastic about many of Mr. Gorbachev's ideas. Walter Rogers, ABC News at the United Nations.
Well, at the UN, the most dramatic concession by Mr. Gorbachev may have been the cutback of Soviet armed forces, but there was more. In laying out this new vision of how international relations should be managed, he placed unusual emphasis on using the UN as a means of resolving international problems. It will take time, but in some fashion the West will have to respond. And then came the summit with President Reagan and Mr. Bush. Here's ABC's Sam Donaldson.
They met for the last time as superpower heads of state at Admiral's House on Governor's Island. Two old pals of the Cold War thaw, joined by the man who will soon pick up the reins of U.S. leadership. The three of them conferred privately for a time, Gorbachev declaring that hardliners in the Soviet Union will not interfere with his announced decision to cut back troop strength in Eastern Europe.
Нет. No. Нет. No. Нет.
And at the luncheon that followed their private meeting, President Reagan said he welcomed Gorbachev's withdrawal initiative.
Naturally, I heartily approve.
And what did Vice President Bush think of Gorbachev's announcement?
I support what the president says.
Appreciative laughter, really, that George Bush was purposely playing in the background, making it clear to Gorbachev he was not there to negotiate. In fact, when the luncheon was over and the principals left, it soon became clear there had been no negotiating on anything. Just
a discussion that was direct and open, lots of humor, cordial,
and marked by a general desire for improved relations, said Schultz. The three principals concluded their visit together by gazing at the New York skyline, headquarters for American capitalism, and at the Statue of Liberty, symbol of American freedom. Perhaps a fitting backdrop for the end of the Reagan-Gorbachev era, which saw a turnaround in U.S.-Soviet relations, and the beginning of the Bush-Gorbachev challenge to carry on.